Hello, how you doing? and by the end of it, I felt like myself again. By which I mean I could look at Felurian with no more reaction than you might normally feel looking at the most beautiful woman in the world. I can still remember her, sitting naked among the cushions, twilight-colored butterflies dancing in the air between us. I wouldn't have been alive had I not been aroused. But my mind seemed to be my own again, and I was grateful for that. She made a disappointed noise of protest as I set the lute back into its case. "Are you weary?" she asked, with a hint of a smile. "I wouldn't have tired you, sweet poet, had I known." I gave my best apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but it seems to be getting late." Actually, the sky still showed the same purple hint of twilight it had since I first woke, but I pushed on. "I'll need to be moving quickly if I'm to meet—" My mind went numb as quickly as if I'd been struck a blow to the back of my head. I felt the passion, fierce and insatiable. I need to have her, to crush her body to mine, to taste the savage sweetness of her mouth. Only because of my arcane training did I hold on to any concept of my own identity at all. Even so, I only held it with my barest fingertips. Felurian sat cross-legged on the cushions across from me, her face angry and terrible, her eyes cold and hard as distant stars. With a deliberate calm, she brushed a slowly fanning butterfly from her shoulder. There was such a weight of fury in her simple gesture that my stomach clenched, and I realized this fact. No one ever left Felurian. Ever. She kept men until their bodies and minds broke beneath the strain of loving her. She kept them until she tired of them, and when she sent them away, it was the leaving that drove men mad. I was powerless. I was a novelty. I was a toy, favorite, because it was newest. It might be a long while before she tired of me, but the time would come. And when she finally set me free, my mind would tear itself apart with wanting her. Chapter 97. Blood and Bitter Rue. As I sat among the silks with my control slipping away, I felt a wave of cold sweat sweep over my body. I clenched my jaw and felt a small anger flare up. Over the course of my life, my mind has been the only thing I've always been able to rely on. The only thing that has always been entirely mine. I could feel my resolve melting as my natural desires were replaced by some animal thing unable to think beyond its own lust. The part of me that was still, quote, raged, but I felt my body respond to her presence. With a horrible fascination, I felt myself crawl through the cushions toward her. One arm found her slender waist, and I bent to kiss her with a terrible hunger. I howled inside my own mind. I have been beaten and whipped, starved and stabbed, but my mind is my own, no matter what becomes of this body or the world around. I threw myself against the bars of an intangible cage made of moonlight and desire, and somehow I held myself away from her. My breath tore out of my throat as if racing to escape. Felurian reclined on the cushions, her head tilted up toward me. Her lips were pale and perfect, her eyes half-lidded and hungry. I forced myself to look away from her face, but there was nowhere safe to look. Her throat was smooth and delicate, trembling with her rapid pulse. One breast stood round and full, while the other angled slightly to one side, following the downward slope of her body. They rose and fell with her breath, moving gently, making candle-cast shadows on her skin. I glimpsed the perfect whiteness of her teeth behind the pale pink of her parted lips. I closed my eyes, but somehow that only made it worse. The heat of her body was like standing near a fire. The skin of her waist was soft beneath my hand. She moved beneath me, and her breast brushed softly against my chest. I felt her breath against my neck. I shivered and began to sweat. I opened my eyes again and saw her staring at me. Her expression was innocent, almost hurt, as if she couldn't understand being refused. I nursed my small flame of anger. No one did this to me. No one. I held myself away from her. A slight line of a frown touched her forehead, as if she were annoyed, or angry, or concentrating. Felurian reached up to touch my face, her eyes intent, as if trying to read something written deep inside me. I tried to pull back, remembering her touch, but my body simply shook. Beads of sweat fell from my skin to patter gently on the silk cushions and the flat plane of her stomach below. She touched my cheek softly. Softly, I bent to kiss her, and something broke in my mind. I felt the snap as 4 years of my life slid away. Suddenly, I was back on the streets of Tarbean. 3 boys, bigger than me, with greasy hair and piggish eyes, had dragged me from the broken crate where I'd been sleeping. 2 of them held me down, pinning my arms. I lay in a stagnant puddle that was bitterly cold. It was early in the morning, and the stars were out. One of them had his hand over my mouth. It didn't matter. I had been in the city for months. I knew better than to yell for help. At best, no one would come. At worst, someone would, and then there would be more of them. 2 of them held me down. The third cut my clothes off my body. He cut me. They told me what they were going to do. Their breath was horribly warm against my face. They laughed. There in Tarbean, half naked and helpless, I felt something well up inside me. I bit 2 fingers off the hand over my mouth. I heard a scream and swearing as one of them staggered away. I strained and strained against the one who was still on top of me. I heard my own arm break and his grip loosened. I started to howl. I threw him off, still screaming. I stood, my clothes hanging in rags around me. I knocked one of them to the ground. My scrabbling hand found a loose cobblestone, and I used it to break one of his legs. I remember the noise it made. I flailed until his arms were broken. Then I broke his head. When I looked up, I saw the one who had cut me was gone. The third huddled against a wall. He clutched his bloody hand to his chest. His eyes were white and wild. Then I heard footsteps approaching, and I dropped the stone and ran and ran and ran. Suddenly, years later, I was that feral boy again. I jerked my head back and snarled inside my mind. I felt something deep inside myself. I reached for it. A tense stillness settled inside of me, the sort of silence that comes before a thunderclap. I felt the air begin to crystallize around me. I felt cold. Detachedly, I gathered up the pieces of my mind and fit them all together. I was Kvothe, the trooper, Edema Ruh born. I was Kvothe, the student, Re'lar under Elodith. I was Kvothe, the musician. I was Kvothe. I stood above Felurian. I felt as if this was the only time in my life I had been fully awake. Everything looked clear and sharp, as if seeing with a new set of eyes, as if I wasn't bothering with my eyes at all, and was looking at the world directly with my mind. The sleeping mind, some piece of me realized faintly. No longer sleeping, I thought, and smiled. I looked at Felurian, and in that moment I understood her down to the bottoms of her feet. She was of the Fae. She did not worry over right or wrong. She was a creature of pure desire, much like a child. A child does not concern itself with consequence, neither does a sudden storm. Felurian resembled both and neither. She was ancient and innocent and powerful and proud. Was this the way Elodin saw the world? Was this the magic he spoke of? Not secrets or tricks, but Taborlin the great magic. Always there, but beyond my seeing until now. It was beautiful. I met Felurian's eyes, and the world grew slow and sluggish. I felt as if I had been thrust underwater, as if my breath had been pressed from my body. For that tiny moment, I was stunned and numb, as if I had been struck by lightning. The moment passed, and things began to move again. But now, looking into Felurian's twilight eyes, I understood her far beyond the bottoms of her feet. Now I knew her to the marrow of her bones. Her eyes were like 4 lines of music, clearly penned. My mind was filled with the sudden song of her. I drew a breath and sang it out in 4 hard notes. Felurian sat upright. She passed her hand before her eyes and spoke a word as sharp as shattered glass. There was a pain like thunder in my head. Darkness flickered at the edges of my sight. I tasted blood and bitter rue. The world snapped back into focus, and I caught myself before I fell. Felurian frowned, straightened, stood. Her face intent, she took a step. Standing, she was not tall or terrible. Her head was barely level with my chin. Her dark hair hung, a sheaf of shadow, straight as a knife until it brushed against her curving hip. She was slight and pale and perfect. Never have I seen a face so sweet, a mouth so made for kissing. She was no longer frowning, not smiling either. Her lips were soft and slightly parted. She took another step. The simple motion of her moving leg was like a dance, the unexaggerated shifting of her hip entrancing as a fire. The arch of her bare foot said more of sex than anything I'd seen in my young life. Another step. Her smile was fierce and full. She was as lovely as the moon. Her power hung about her like a mantle. It shook the air. It spread behind her like a pair of vast and unseen wings. Close enough to touch, I felt her power thrumming in the air. Desire rose around me like the sea in storm. She raised her hand. She touched my chest. I shook. She met my eyes, and in the twilight written there I saw again the 4 clear lines of song. I sang them out. They burst from me like birds into the open air. Suddenly, my mind was clear again. I drew a breath and held her eyes in mine. I sang again, and this time I was full of rage. I shouted out the 4 hard notes of song. I sang them tight and white and hard as iron. And at the sound of them, I felt her power shape, then shatter, leaving nothing in the empty air but ache and anger. Felurian gave a startled cry and sat so suddenly that it was almost like a fall. She curled her knees toward herself and huddled, watching me with wide and frightened eyes. Looking around, I saw the wind. Not the way you might see smoke or fog. I saw the ever-changing wind itself. It was familiar as the face of a forgotten friend. I laughed and spread my arms, marveling at its shifting shape. I cupped my hands and breathed a sigh into the hollow space within. I spoke a name. I moved my hands and wove my breath gossamer thin. It billowed out, engulfing her, then burst into a silver flame that trapped her tight inside its changing name. I held her there above the ground. She watched me with an air of fear and disbelief, her dark hair dancing like a second flame inside the first. I knew then that I could kill her. It would be as simple as throwing a sheet of paper to the wind. But the thought sickened me, and I was reminded of ripping the wings from a butterfly. Killing her would be destroying something strange and wonderful. A world without Felurian was a poorer world. A world I would like a little less. It would be like breaking Ilian's lute. It would be like burning down a library in addition to ending a life. On the other hand, my safety and sanity were at stake. I believed the world was more interesting with Kvothe in it as well. But I couldn't kill her. Not like this. Not wielding my newfound magic like a dissecting knife. I spoke again, and the wind brought her down among the pillows. I made a tearing motion, and the silver flame that once had been my breath became 3 notes of broken song and went to play among the trees. I sat. She reclined. We looked each other over for several long minutes. Her eyes flashed from fear to caution to curiosity. I saw myself reflected in her eyes, naked among the cushions. My power rode like a white star on my brow. Then I began to feel a fading. of forgetting. I realized the name of the wind no longer filled my mouth, and when I looked around, I saw nothing but empty air. I tried to remain outwardly calm, but as these things left me, I felt like a lute whose strings were being cut. My heart clenched with a loss I hadn't felt since my parents died. I could see a slight shimmer in the air around Felurian, some shred of her power returning. I ignored it as I struggled frantically to keep some part of what I had learned. But it was like trying to hold a handful of sand. If you have ever dreamed of flying, then come awake, dismayed to realize you had lost the trick of it, you have some inkling how I felt. Piece by piece it faded until there was nothing left. I felt a hollow inside, and ached as badly as if I'd discovered my family never loved me. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. Felurian looked at me curiously. I could still see myself reflected in her eyes, the star on my forehead no more than a pinprick of light. Then, even the perfect vision of my sleeping mind began to fade. I looked desperately at the world around me. I tried to memorize the sight of it, unblinking. Then it was gone. I bowed my head, half in grief and half to hide the tears. Chapter 98. The Lay of Felurian. A long moment passed before I regained enough of my composure to look up. There was a hesitancy in the air, as if we were young lovers who didn't know what was expected of us next, who didn't know what parts we were supposed to play. I picked up my lute and brought it close to my chest. The motion was instinctive, like clutching a wounded hand. I struck a chord out of habit, then made it minor so the lute seemed to be saying sad. Without thinking or looking up, I began to play one of the songs I had written in the months after my parents died. It was called Sitting by the Water, Remembering. My fingers strummed sorrow into the evening air. It was several minutes before I realized what I was doing, and several more before I stopped. I wasn't done with the song. I don't know if it really has an ending. I felt better. Not good by any means, but better. Less empty. My music always helped. As long as I had my music, no burden was ever too heavy to bear. I looked up and saw tears on Felurian's face. It made me less ashamed of my own. I also felt myself wanting her. The emotion was damped by the ache in my chest, but that touch of desire focused my attention on my most immediate concern: survival, escape. Felurian seemed to reach a decision and started through the cushions toward me. Moving in a cautious crawl, she stopped several feet away and looked at me. Does my tender poet have a name? Her voice was so gentle, it startled me. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped. I thought of the moon, caught by her own name, and 1,000 fairy stories I had heard as a child. If you believed Elodin, names were the bones of the world. I hesitated for about half a second before I decided I had given Felurian a damn sight more than my name already. I am Kvothe. The sound of it seemed to ground me, to put me inside myself again. Oh. She spoke it softly, and it reminded me of a bird calling. Would you sing sweet for me again? She reached out slowly, as if afraid of being burned, and laid her hand lightly on my arm. Please. Your songs are like a caress, my Kvothe. She pronounced my name like the beginning of a song. It was lovely. However, I wasn't entirely comfortable with the way she referred to me as her Kvothe. I smiled and nodded, mostly because I didn't have any idea. I struck a couple of tuning chords, then paused, thinking. Then I started to play In the Forest Fed, a song about, of all things, Felurian herself. It wasn't particularly good. It used about 3 chords and 24 words, but it had the effect I was looking for. Felurian brightened at the mention of her name. There was no false modesty in her. She knew she was most beautiful, most skilled. She knew men told stories, and she knew her reputation. No man could resist her. No man could endure her. By the end of the song, pride had her sitting straighter. I finished the song. Would you like to hear another? I asked. She nodded and grinned eagerly. She sat among the cushions, back straight, as regal as a queen. I moved into a second song, similar to the first. It was called Lady Faye, or something of the sort. I didn't know who had written it, but they had an appalling habit of sticking extra syllables into their lines. It wasn't bad enough to get anything thrown at me in a tavern, but it was close. I watched Felurian closely as I played. She was flattered, but I could read a slight dissatisfaction growing, as if she was irritated, but she couldn't decide why. Perfect. Last, I played a song written for Queen Seru. I guarantee you haven't heard it, but I'm sure you know the type. Written by some toadying minstrel looking for a patronage, my father had taught it to me as an example of certain things to avoid when writing a song. It was a numbing example of mediocrity. You could tell the writer was either truly inept, had never met Seru, or that he simply didn't find her attractive at all. While singing it, I simply exchanged the name Felurian for Seru. I also replaced some of the better phrases with less poetic ones. By the time I was through with it, the song was truly wretched, and Felurian wore an expression of naked dismay upon her face. I sat for a long moment, as if deeply considering something. When I finally did speak, my voice was hushed and hesitant. Lady, might I write a song for you? I gave her a sheepish smile. Her smile was like the moon through the clouds. She clapped her hands and threw herself onto me with a kittenish delight, peppering me with kisses. Only fear that my lute might be broken kept me from properly enjoying the experience. Felurian pulled away and sat very still. I tried a couple of chord combinations, then stilled my hands and looked up at her. I will call it The Lay of Felurian. She blushed a bit and looked at me through lowered eyes, her expression bashful and brazen. All immodest boasting aside, I write a fine song when I set my hand to it, and my skills had recently been sharpened in the mayor's employ. I am not the best, but I am one of the best. Given enough time, a worthy subject, and the proper motivation, I dare say I could write a song nearly as well as Iliad. Nearly. Closing my eyes, I coaxed sweet strains from my lute. My fingers flew, captured the music of wind in the branches, of rustling leaves. Then I looked to the back of my mind where the mad, chattering part of me had been composing a song to Felurian all this while. I brushed the strings more lightly and began to sing. Flashing moon silver, midnight blue her eyes. The lids were subtle-colored butterflies. Her hair swayed, a dark scythe swinging, through the trees with the wind singing. Felurian, O lady fair, blessed be your forest glade. Your breath is light upon the air, your hair is shadow-dappled shade. Felurian grew still as I sang. Toward the end of the chorus, I could hardly tell if she was breathing. A few of the butterflies that had been frightened away by our earlier conflict came dancing back to us. One of them landed on Felurian's hand, brushing its wings once, twice, as if curious why its mistress was so sudden still. I turned my eyes to my lute again and chose notes like raindrops licking the leaves of trees. She danced in dancing shadows candle cast. She held my eyes, my face, my form full fast. Her smile a snare 10 times as strong as legendary fairy song. O lady fair, Felurian, your kiss is honeysuckle sweet. I pity any other man, unknown to you and incomplete. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She sat as if listening with her entire body. Her eyes were wide. She'd raised one hand to her mouth, upsetting the butterfly resting there, while the other pressed against her chest as she drew a slow breath. This is what I had wanted, but I regretted it nonetheless. I bent over my lute and danced my fingers across the strings. I wove chords like water over river stones, like a soft breath against the ear. Then I steeled myself and sang. Her eyes were of the bluest black, like night sky with the clouds blown back. Her skills in love. I stuttered my fingers on the strings, pausing for just a moment, as if unsure of something. I saw Felurian wake halfway from her reverie, and continued. Her skills in love they do suffice. In close embrace men find her nice. Felurian, oh mistress bright, your touch more soft than silver, What? Even though I was expecting the interruption, the ice in her voice startled me into a jangle of notes and sent several butterflies into flight. I took a breath, assumed my most innocent expression, and looked up. Her expression was a storm of rage and disbelief. Nice? I felt the blood drain from my face at her tone. Her voice was still round and gentle as a distant flute, but that meant nothing. Distant thunder doesn't drug the ears. You feel it prowling through your chest. The quiet of her voice moved through me in that distant thunder way. Nice? It was nice, I said to mollify her, my air of innocence only half affected. She opened her mouth as if she would speak, then closed her mouth. Her eyes flashed pure fury. I'm sorry, I said. I should have known better than to try. I pitched my voice somewhere between broken spirit and beaten child. I lowered my hands from the lute strings. Some of the fire left her, but when she found her voice, it was tight and dangerous. My skills suffice? She hardly seemed able to force out the last word. Her mouth formed a thin, outraged line. I exploded, my voice a roll of thunder. How the hell am I supposed to know? It's not like I've ever done this sort of thing before. She reeled back at the vehemence of my words, some of the anger draining out of her. What is it you mean? She trailed off, confused. This! I gestured awkwardly at myself, at her, at the cushions and the pavilion around us, as if that explained everything. The last of the anger left her as I saw realization begin to dawn. You... No! I looked down, my face growing hot. I have never been with a woman. Then I straightened and looked her in the eye as if challenging her to make an issue out of it. Felurian was still for a moment. Then her mouth turned up into a wry smile. You tell me a fairy story, my quoth. I felt my face go grim. I don't mind being called a liar. I am. I am a marvelous liar. But I hate being called a liar when I'm telling the perfect truth. Regardless of its motivation, my expressions seemed to convince her. But you were like a gentle summer storm. She made a fluttering gesture with a hand. You were a dancer fresh upon the field. Her eyes glittered wickedly. I tucked that comment away for later ego-polishing purposes. My reply was slightly wounded. Please, I'm not a complete rube. I've read several books. Felurian giggled like a brook. You learned from books? She looked at me as if she couldn't decide whether or not to take me seriously. She laughed, stopped, then laughed again. I didn't know if I should be offended. You were rather good too, I said hurriedly, knowing I sounded like the last dinner guest to compliment her on the salad. As a matter of fact, I've read books. Books. You compare me with books. Her anger crashed over me. Then, without even pausing for breath, Felurian laughed again, high and delighted. Her laugh was wild as a fox's cry, clear and sharp as morning bird song. It was no human sound. I put on my innocent face. Isn't it always like this? I kept my expression calm, while inwardly, I braced myself for another outburst. She simply sat. I am Felurian. It wasn't a simple stating of a name. It was a declaration. It was a proud flag flying. I held her eyes for a moment, then sighed and dropped my gaze to my lute. I'm sorry about the song. I didn't mean to offend you. It was more lovely than the setting sun, she protested, sounding close to tears. But nice? The words seemed bitter to her. I set my lute back into its case. I'm sorry. I can't fix it without some basis for comparison. I sighed. Pity. It was a good song. They would have sung it for 1,000 years. My voice was thick with regret. Felurian's expression brightened as if with an idea. Then her eyes narrowed into slits. She looked at me as if she was trying to read something written on the inside of my skull. She knew. She knew I was holding the unfinished song as ransom. The unspoken messages were clear. Unless I leave, I can never finish the song. Unless I leave, no one will ever hear these beautiful words I have made for you. Unless I leave and taste the fruits mortal women have to offer, I'll never know how skilled you truly are. There, amid the cushions, under the eternal twilight sky, Felurian and I stared at each other. She held a butterfly, and my hand rested on the smooth wood of my lute. Two armored knights eyeing each other across a bloody field could not have matched the intensity of our stare. Felurian spoke slowly, gauging my response. If you go, will you finish it? I tried to look surprised, but I wasn't fooling her. I nodded. Will you come back to me and sing it? My surprise became genuine. I hadn't considered her asking for that. I knew there would be no leaving the second time. I hesitated, but only for a barest moment. Half a loaf is better than none. I nodded. Promise? I nodded again. Promise with kisses? She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, like a flower basking in the sun. Life is too short for offers like that. I moved toward her, drew her naked body toward my own, and kissed her as well as my limited practice would allow. It seemed to be good enough. As I pulled away, she looked up at me and sighed. Your kisses are like snowflakes on my lips. She lay back on the cushions, head resting on her arm. Her free hand brushed my cheek. To say she was lovely is such an understatement, I cannot begin to repair it. I realized that over the last several minutes, she hadn't been trying to make me desire her, at least not in any supernatural sense. She brushed her lips lightly over the palm of my hand and released it. Then she lay still, watching me intently. I was flattered. To this day, I know of only one answer to a question so politely phrased. I bent to kiss her, and laughing, she took me in her arms. Chapter 99, Magic of a Different Kind. By this point in my life, I'd earned myself a modest reputation. No, that's not entirely true. It's better to say that I had built myself a reputation. I'd crafted it deliberately. I'd cultivated it. 3/4 of the stories folk told about me at the university were ridiculous rumors I'd started myself. I spoke 8 languages. I could see in the dark. When I was 3 days old, my mother hung me in a basket from a rowan tree by the light of the full moon. That night a fairy laid a powerful charm on me to always keep me safe. It turned my eyes from blue to leafy green. I knew how stories worked, you see. Nobody believed I traded a cupped handful of my own fresh blood to a demon in exchange for a blade of Ramsden steel. But still, I was the highest ranked duelist in Dahl's class. On a good day, I could beat any 2 of them together. That thread of truth wove through the story, gave it strength. So even though you might not believe it, you might tell it to a wide-eyed first-term student with a
merde.
Drink in him, just to watch his face, just for fun. And if you'd had a drink or three yourself, you might begin to wonder. And so the stories spread. And so around the university, at least, my tiny reputation grew. There were a few true stories as well. Pieces of my reputation I'd honestly earned. I had rescued Fella from a blazing inferno. I had been whipped in front of a crowd and refused to bleed. I'd called the wind and broken Ambrose's arm. Still, I knew my reputation was a coat spun out of cobweb. It was storybook nonsense. There were no demons out there, bargaining for blood. There were no helpful fairies granting magic charms, and though I might pretend, I knew I was no Taborlin the Great. These were my thoughts when I woke, tangled in Felurian's arms. I lay quietly among the cushions for a time, her head resting lightly on my chest, her leg thrown loosely over mine. Looking up through the trees at the twilight sky, I realized I could not recognize the stars. They were brighter than those in the mortal sky, their patterns unfamiliar. It was only then that I realized my life had taken a step in a new direction. Up until now, I had been playing at being a young Taborlin. I had spun lies around myself, pretending to be a storybook hero. But now, there was no sense pretending. What I'd done was truly worth a story, every bit as odd and wonderful as any tale of Taborlin himself. I'd followed Felurian into the Fae, then bested her with magics I couldn't explain, let alone control. I felt different now, more solid somehow. Not older exactly, not wiser, but I knew things that I'd never known before. I knew the Fae were real. I knew their magic was real. Felurian could break a man's mind with a kiss. Her voice could tug me like a puppet by its strings. There were things I could learn here. Strange things. Powerful things. Secret things. Things I might never ever have a chance to learn again. I gently freed myself from Felurian's sleeping embrace and walked down to the nearby pool. I splashed water on my face and scooped up several handfuls to drink. I looked through the plants that grew at the water's edge. I picked some leaves and chewed them as I considered how I might approach the subject with Felurian. The mint sweetened my breath. When I returned to the pavilion, Felurian was standing there, brushing pale fingers through her long, dark hair. I handed her a violet, its color dark as her eyes. She smiled at me and ate it. I decided to approach the subject gently, lest I offend her. I was wondering, I said carefully, if you would be willing to teach me. She reached out to touch the side of my face gently. Foolish sweet, she said fondly. Have not I already begun? I felt excitement rise in my chest, amazed that it could be so simple. Am I ready for my next lesson? I asked. Her smile grew wider, and she looked me up and down, her eyes going half-lidded and mysterious. Are you? I nodded. It is good you are eager, Felurian said, her fluting voice tinged with amusement. You have some cleverness and natural skill, but there is much to learn. She looked into my eyes, her delicate face gravely serious. When you leave to walk among the mortal, I will not have you shame me. Felurian took my hand and drew me into the pavilion. She pointed. Sit. I sat on a cushion, placing my head level with the smooth expanse of her stomach. Her navel was terribly distracting. She looked down at me, her expression proud and regal as a queen. A Mawan, she said, spreading the fingers of one hand and making a deliberate gesture. This we call the hushed heart, an easy lesson to begin, and one I expect you will enjoy. Felurian smiled at me then, her eyes old and knowing. And even before she pushed me back against the cushions and began to bite the side of my neck, I realized that she did not intend to teach me magic. Or if she did, it was magic of a different kind. While it was not the subject I'd hoped to study under her, It's fair to say that I was not entirely disappointed. Learning lovers' arts from Felurian far outstripped any curriculum offered at the university. I'm not referring to the vigorous, sweaty wrestling most men, and alas, most women, think of as love. While sweat and vigor are pleasant parts of it, Felurian brought to my attention the subtler pieces. If I were to go into the world, she said, I would not embarrass her by being an incompetent lover, and so she took care to show me a great many things. A few of them in her words: the pinioned wrist, the sigh toward the ear, devouring the neck, drawing the lips, the kissing of the throat, the navel, and, as Felurian phrased it, the woman's flower. The breathing kiss, the feather kiss, the climbing kiss, so many different types of kissing, too many to remember. Almost. There was drawing water from the well, the fluttering hand, bird song at morning, circling the moon, playing ivy, the harrowed hair. Just the names would fill a book. But this, I suppose, is not the place for such things. Alas, then, for the world. I don't mean to give the impression that all our hours were spent in dalliance. I was young, and Felurian was immortal, but there is only so much two bodies can endure. The rest of the time we amused ourselves in other ways. We swam and ate. I played songs for Felurian, and she danced for me. I asked Felurian a few careful questions about magic, not wanting to offend her by prying at her secrets. Unfortunately, her answers were not particularly enlightening. Her magic came as naturally as breathing. I might as well have asked a farmer how seeds sprouted. When her answers weren't hopelessly nonchalant, they were puzzlingly cryptic. Still, I continued to ask, and she answered as best she could, and occasionally I felt a small spark of understanding. But most of our time was spent telling stories. We had so little in common that stories were all that we could share. You might think Felurian and I would be unevenly matched in this regard. She was older than the sky, while I was not yet 17. But Felurian was not the narrative treasure trove you would think. Powerful and clever? Certainly. Energetic and lovely? Absolutely. But storytelling was not among her many gifts. I, on the other hand, was of the Edema Ruh, and we know all the stories in the world. So I told her The Ghost and the Goose Girl. I told her Tam and the Tinker's Spade. I told her stories of woodcutters and widows' daughters and the cleverness of orphan boys. In exchange, Felurian told me manling stories. The Hand at the Heart of the Pearl, The Boy Who Ran Between. The Fae have their own cast of legendary characters. Maven the Man-Shaped, Alavan Allface. Surprisingly, Felurian had never heard of Taborlin the Great or Oren Velsitor, but she did know who Ilian was. It made me proud that one of the Edema Ruh had gained a place in the stories the Fae tell each other. I wasn't blind to the fact that Felurian herself might have the information I was looking for about the Aemir and the Chandrian. How much more enjoyable would it be to learn the truth from her rather than rooting endlessly through ancient books and dusty rooms? Unfortunately, Felurian wasn't the mine of information I'd hoped. She knew stories of the Aemir, but they were thousands of years old. When I asked her about the more recent Aemir, asking about church knights and the Ciridae with their bloody tattoos, she merely laughed. "There were never any human Aemir," she said, dismissing the idea out of hand. "Those you speak of sound like children dressing in their parents' clothes." While I might expect that reaction from others, getting it from Felurian was particularly disheartening. Still, it was nice to know I had been right about the Aemir existing long before they became Knights of the Talon Church. Then, since the Aemir were a lost cause, I tried to steer her in the direction of the Chandrian. "No," she said, looking me squarely in the eye, her back straight. "I will not speak of the Seven." Her soft voice held no lilting whimsy, no playfulness, no room for discussion or negotiation. For the first time since our initial conflict, I felt a trickle of icy fear sweep over me. She was so slight and lovely. It was so easy to forget what she truly was. Still, I couldn't let the subject go so easily. This was, quite literally, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If Felurian could be persuaded to tell me even a piece of what she knew, I could learn things no one else in the world might know. I gave her my most charming smile and drew a breath to speak, but before I could get the first word out, Felurian leaned forward and kissed me full upon the mouth. Her lips were plush and warm. Her tongue brushed mine, and she bit the swell of my lower lip playfully. When she pulled her mouth from mine, it left me breathless with a racing heart. She looked at me, her dark eyes full of tender sweetness. She laid her hand along my face, brushing my cheek as gently as a flower. "My sweet love," she said, "if you ask of the 7 again in this place, I will drive you from it. No matter if your asking be firm or gentle, honest or slantways. If you ask, I will whip you forth from here with a lash of brambles and snakes. I will drive you before me, bloody and weeping, and will not stop until you are dead or fled from Fae." She didn't look away from me as she spoke, and though I hadn't looked away or seen them change, her eyes were no longer soft with adoration. They were dark as storm clouds, hard as ice. "I do not jest," she said. "I swear this by my flower and the ever-moving moon. I swear it by salt and stone and sky. I swear this singing and laughing by the sound of my own name." She kissed me again, pressing her lips to mine tenderly. "I will do this thing." And that was the end of it. I might be a fool, but I am not that much of a fool. Felurian was more than willing to talk about the Fey realm itself, and many of her stories detailed the fractious politics of the Feyan courts, the Toyne Mail, the Dain Dan, the Gorse Court. These stories were difficult for me to follow, as I didn't know anything about the factions involved, let alone the web of alliances, false friendships, open secrets, and old grudges that bound Fey society together. This was complicated by the fact that Felurian took it for granted that I understood certain things. If I were telling you a story, for example, I wouldn't bother mentioning that most moneylenders are Sealdish, or that there is no royalty older than the Modagan royal line. Who doesn't know such things? Felurian left similar details out of her stories. Who wouldn't know, for example, that the Gorse court had meddled in the Baron Taltha between the Mail and the House of Fine? And why was this important? Well, of course, that would lead to members of the Gorse being scorned by those on the Dayward side of things. And what was the Baron Taltha? A sort of dance. And why was this dance important? After a handful of questions such as this, Felurian's eyes would narrow. I quickly learned it was better to follow along, quiet and confused, rather than try to winkle out every detail and risk her irritation. Still, I learned things from these stories. 1,000 small scattered facts about the Fae. The names of the courts, old battles, and notable persons. I learned you must never look at one of the Theana with both eyes at once, and that the gift of a single Sinus fruit is considered a terrible insult if given to one of the Beladari. You might think these 1,000 facts gave me some insight into the Fae, that I somehow fit them together like puzzle pieces and discovered the true shape of things. 1,000 facts is quite a lot, after all. But no. 1,000 seems like a lot, but there are more stars than that in the sky, and they make neither a map nor a mural. All I knew for certain after hearing Felurian's stories is that I had no desire to ever entangle myself in even the kindest corner of the Feyan court. With my luck, I'd whistle while walking under a willow and thereby insult God's barber or something of the sort. Here is the one thing I learned from these stories. The Fae are not like us. This is endlessly easy to forget because many of them look as we do. They speak our language. They have 2 eyes. They have hands, and their mouths make familiar shapes when they smile. But these things are only seemings. We are not the same. I have heard people say that men and the Fae are as different as dogs and wolves. While this is an easy analogy, it is far from true. Wolves and dogs are only separated by a minor shade of blood. Both howl at night. If beaten, both will bite. No. Our people and theirs are as different as water and alcohol. In equal glasses, they look the same. Both liquid, both clear, both wet after a fashion. But one will burn, the other will not. This has nothing to do with temperament or timing. These two things behave differently because they are profoundly, fundamentally not the same. The same is true with humans and the Fae. We forget it at our peril. Chapter 100. Shade. I should perhaps explain a few peculiarities of the Fae. At first glance, Felurian's forest glade did not seem particularly odd. In most ways, it resembled an ancient, untouched piece of forest. If not for the unfamiliar stars above, I might have suspected I was still in an isolated piece of the Eld. But there were differences. Since I had left my mercenary companions, I had slept perhaps a dozen times. Despite this, the sky above Felurian's pavilion remained the deep purpling blue of summer dusk and showed no signs of changing. I had only the roughest guess as to how long I had been in the Fae. More importantly, I had no idea how much time might have been passing in the mortal world. Stories are full of boys who fall asleep in fairy circles only to wake as old men. Young girls wander into the woods and return years later looking no older and claiming only minutes have passed. For all I knew, years could pass each time I slept in Felurian's arms. I could return to find a century had passed, or no time at all. I did my best not to think about it. Only a fool worries over what he can't control. The other difference in the Fae realm was much more subtle and difficult to describe. In the Medica, I had spent a fair amount of time around unconscious patients. I mention this to make a point. There is a great difference between being in a room that is empty and being in a room where someone is sleeping. A sleeping person is a presence in a room. They are aware of you, even if it is only a dim, vague awareness. That is what the Fae was like. It was such an odd, intangible thing that I didn't notice it for a long while. Then, once I became aware of it, it took me much longer to lay my finger on what the difference was. It felt as if I had moved from an empty room into a room where someone was asleep, except, of course, that there was no one there. It was as if everything around me was deeply asleep. The trees, the stones, the rippling stream that widened into Felurian's pool. All these things felt more solid, more present than I was used to, as if they were ever so slightly aware of me. The thought that I would eventually leave the Fae alive and unbroken was an unfamiliar one for Felurian, and I could tell it troubled her. Often, while in the midst of an unrelated conversation, she would change direction and make me promise to return to her. I reassured her as best I could, but there are only so many ways you can say the same thing. After perhaps 36 times, I said, "I will do my best to keep myself safe so I can come back to you." I saw her face change, becoming first anxious, then grim, then thoughtful. For a moment, I worried she had decided to keep me as a pet mortal after all, and I began to berate myself for not fleeing the Fae when I had the chance. But before I could begin to grow genuinely concerned, Felurian cocked her head to one side and seemed to change the subject. "Would my sweet flame like a coat? A cloak?" "I have one," I said, gesturing to where my possessions lay scattered at the edge of the pavilion. Only then did I notice that the tatty old tinker's cloak wasn't there. I saw my clothes, my boots, and my travel sack still bulging with the mayor's lockbox. But my cloak and sword were gone. The fact that I hadn't noticed their absence was understandable, as I hadn't bothered dressing since I first woke next to Felurian. She looked me over slowly, her expression intent, her eyes lingering on my knee, my lower arm, my upper arm. It was only when she took hold of my shoulder, turned me so she could examine my back, that I realized she was looking at my scars. Felurian took hold of my hand and traced a pale line that ran along my forearm. You are not good at keeping yourself safe, my Kvothe. I was a little offended, especially as there was more than a little truth to what she said. I do fairly well, I said stiffly, considering the trouble that I find. Felurian turned over my hand and examined my palm and fingers closely. You are not a fighter, she mused softly to herself. Yet you are all iron-bitten. You are a sweet bird that cannot fly. No bow, no knife, no chain. Her hand moved to my foot, running thoughtfully along the calluses and scars from my years on the streets of Tarbean. You are a long walker. You find me in the wild at night. You are a deep knower, and bold, and young, and trouble finds you. She looked up at me, her face intent. Would my sweet poet like a shade? A what? She paused as if considering her words. A shadow. I smiled. I already have one. Then I checked to make sure. I was in the Fae, after all. Felurian frowned, shaking her head at my lack of understanding. Another I would give a shield, and it would keep him safe from harm. Another I would gift with amber, bind a scabbard tight with glamour, or craft a crown so men might look on you with love. She shook her head solemnly. But not for you. You are a night walker, a moon follower. You must be safe from iron, from cold, from spite. You must be quiet. You must be light. You must move softly in the night. You must be quick and unafraid. She nodded to herself. This means I must make you a shade. She stood and started walking toward the forest. Come, she said. Felurian had a way of making requests that took some getting used to. I discovered that unless I was steeling myself to resist, I'd find myself automatically doing whatever it was she asked of me. It wasn't that she spoke with authority. Her voice was too soft and edgeless to carry the weight of command. She did not demand or cajole. When she spoke, it was matter of fact, as if she couldn't imagine a world in which you didn't want to do exactly as she said. Because of this, when Felurian told me to follow her, I jumped like a puppet with its strings pulled. Soon, I was padding along beside her, deep in the twilight shadows of the ancient forest, naked as a jaybird. I almost went back to grab my clothes, then decided to follow some advice my father had given me when I was young. Everyone eats a different part of the pig, he'd said. You want to fit in? You'll do the same. Different places, different decorums. So I followed, naked and unprepared. Felurian struck out at a good pace, the moss muffling the sound of our bare feet. As we walked, the forest grew darker. At first, I thought it was simply the branches of the trees arching over our heads. Then I realized the truth. Above us, the twilight sky was slowly growing darker. Eventually, the last hint of purple was gone, leaving the sky a perfect velvet black, flecked with unfamiliar stars. Felurian kept walking. I could see her pale skin in the starlight and the shapes of trees around us, but nothing more. Thinking myself clever, I made a sympathetic binding for light and held my hand above my head as if it were a torch. I was more than slightly proud of this, as the motion to light binding is rather difficult without a piece of metal to use as a focus. Light swelled, and I caught a moment's glimpse of our surroundings. Dark trunks of trees rose like massive pillars as far as the eye could see. There were no low-hanging branches, no undergrowth, no grass, only dark moss underfoot and the arch of dark branches overhead. I was reminded of a vast, empty cathedral swathed in sooty velvet. Siarnalius, Felurian snapped. Understanding her tone, if not her words, I broke the binding and let the darkness rush back over us. An instant later, Felurian leapt at me and bore me to the ground, her lithe, naked body pressed against mine. It was not an entirely uncommon occurrence, but this time The experience was not particularly erotic, as the back of my head struck a knuckle of protruding root. Because of this, I was half dazed and 9/10 blind when the earth shuddered slightly beneath us. Something vast and almost perfectly silent stirred the air above us and slightly off to one side of where we lay. Poised atop me, one leg on either side, Valorian's body was as taut as a harp string. The muscles of her thighs were tense and quivering. Her long hair fell over us, covering us like a silk sheet. Her breasts pressed against my chest as she drew a shallow, silent breath. Her body thrummed with the rhythm of her racing heart, and I felt her mouth move where it rested near the hollow of my throat. Softer than a whisper, Valorian spoke a gentle, edgeless word. I felt it press against my skin, sending silent ripples through the air the same way a thrown stone makes circles on the surface of a pond. There was a soft sound of movement above us, as if someone was folding a huge piece of velvet around a piece of broken glass. Saying that, I realize it makes no sense, but still, that is the best way I can describe the sound. It was a soft noise, the half-heard sound of deliberate movement. I cannot tell you why it made me think of something terrible and sharp, but it did. My forehead prickled with sweat, and I was filled with a sudden pure and breathless terror. Valorian went perfectly still, as if she were a startled deer or a cat about to pounce. Quietly, she drew a breath, then spoke a second word. Her breath brushed hot against my throat, and at the half-heard word, my body thrummed as if I were a drumhead soundly struck. Valorian turned her head a bare degree, as if straining to listen. This movement pulled 1,000 strands of her splayed hair slowly over the entire left half of my naked body, covering me in goose flesh. Even in the grip of my nameless terror, I shivered and gave a soft, involuntary gasp. There was a stirring in the air directly above us. The sharp nails of Valorian's left hand dug hard into the muscle of my shoulder. She shifted her hips and slowly slid her naked body up along my own until her face was even with mine. Her tongue flicked against my lips, and without even thinking, I tilted my head, reaching for the kiss. Her mouth met mine, and she drew a long, slow breath, pulling the air out of me. I felt my head grow light. Then, her lips still tight against mine, Valorian pushed her breath hard into me, filling my lungs. It was softer than silent. It tasted of honeysuckle. The ground shivered beneath me, and everything was still. For an endless moment, my heart ceased beating in my chest. A subtle tension left the air above us. Valorian pulled her mouth from mine, and my heart thumped again, sudden and hard. A second beat. A third. I pulled in a deep, shaking breath. Only then did Valorian relax. She lay atop me, loose and supple, her naked body flowing over mine like water. Her head nestled into the curve of my neck, and she gave a sweet, contented sigh. A languid moment passed. Then she laughed, her body shaking with it. It was wild and delighted, as if she had just played the most marvelous joke. She sat up and kissed my mouth fiercely, then nipped at my ear before climbing off me and pulling me to my feet. I opened my mouth, then closed it, deciding this was probably not the right time for questions. Half of seeming clever is keeping your mouth shut at the right times. So we continued in darkness. Eventually my eyes adjusted, and through the branches above I could see the stars, differently patterned and brighter than those in the mortal sky. Their light was barely enough to give an impression of the ground and surrounding trees. Valorian's slender form was a silver shadow in the darkness. We kept walking, and the trees grew taller and thicker, blocking out the pale starlight bit by bit. Then it became truly dark. Valorian was little more than a piece of pale darkness ahead of me. She stopped walking before I lost sight of her entirely and cupped her hands around her mouth as if she were about to shout. I cringed at the thought of a loud noise invading the warm quiet of this place.
But instead of a shout, there was nothing. No, not nothing. It was like a low, slow purr. Not anything so loud and rough as a cat's purr. It was closer to the sound a heavy snowfall makes, a muffled hush that almost makes less noise than no noise at all. Valorian did this several times. Then she took me by the hand and led me farther into the dark, where she repeated the odd, almost inaudible noise. After she had done this 3 times, it was so dark I could no longer see even the faintest shape of her. After the final pause, Valorian stepped close to me in the dark, pressing her body to mine. She gave me a long and thorough kiss that I expected to become something more involved when she pulled away and spoke softly into my ear. "Quietly," she breathed. "They come." For several minutes, I strained my eyes and ears to no avail. Then, I saw something luminous in the distance. It disappeared quickly, and I thought my light-starved eyes were playing tricks on me. Then, I saw another flicker. 2 more. 10. 100 pale lights danced toward us through the trees, faint as foxfire. I'd heard of fool's fire before, but never seen it. And given that we were in the Fae, I doubted this was anything so mundane. I thought of 100 fairy stories and wondered which of those creatures could be responsible for these dim, madly dancing lights. Tom Sparks? Will-o-wisps? Dennerlings with lanterns full of corpse light? Then they were all around us, startling me. The lights were smaller than I'd thought, and closer. I heard the hushed snowfall sound again, this time from all around me. I still couldn't guess what they might be until one of them brushed my arm as lightly as a feather. They were moths of some sort. Moths with luminescent patches on their wings. They shone with a pale silvery light too weak to illuminate anything around them. But hundreds of them, dancing between the boles of trees, showed the silhouette of our surroundings. Some of them lit on trees or the ground. A few landed on Valorian, and though I still could not see more than a few inches of her pale skin, I could use the moving light of them to follow her. We walked a long while after that, Valorian leading between the trunks of ancient trees. Once I felt grass soft beneath my bare feet instead of moss. Then there was soft soil, as if we were crossing a farmer's fresh-tilled field. For a time, we followed a twisting path of smooth, paved stones that led us over the arch of a high bridge. All the while, the moths followed us, giving me only the dimmest impression of our surroundings. Eventually, Valorian stopped. By now, the darkness was so thick, I could almost feel it like a warm blanket around me. I could tell by the sound of the wind in the trees and the motion of the moths that we were standing in an open space. There were no stars above us. If we were in a clearing, the trees must be vast for their branches to meet overhead. But for all I knew, we could just as easily be deep underground. Or perhaps the sky was black and empty in this portion of the Fae. It was a strangely unsettling thought. The subtle feeling of sleeping alertness was stronger here. If the rest of the Fae felt like it was sleeping, this place felt like it had stirred half a moment ago and hovered on the verge of waking. It was disconcerting. Valorian gently pressed the flat of her hand against my chest, then a finger against my lips. I watched as she moved away from me, softly humming a little snatch of the song I had made for her. But even this piece of flattery couldn't distract me from the fact that I was in the center of the Fae realm, blind, stark naked, and without the slightest idea of what was going on. A handful of moths had landed on Valorian, resting on her wrist, hip, shoulder, and thigh. Watching them gave me a vague impression of her movements. If I had to guess, I would have said she was picking things out of the trees, from behind or beneath bushes or stones. A warm breeze sighed through the clearing, and I felt strangely comforted as it brushed my bare skin. After about 10 minutes, Valorian came back and kissed me. She held something soft and warm in her arms. We walked back the way we had come. The moths gradually lost interest in us, leaving us with less and less of an impression of our surroundings. After what seemed an interminable amount of time, I saw light filtering through a break in the trees ahead. It was only faint starlight, but at that moment, it seemed bright as a curtain of burning diamonds. I started to walk through it, but Felurian took hold of my arm to stop me. Without a word, she sat me down where the first faint beams of starlight lanced through the trees to touch the ground. Carefully, she stepped between the rays of starlight, avoiding them as if they might burn her. When she stood in the center of them, she lowered herself to the ground and sat cross-legged facing me. She held whatever she had collected in her lap, but other than the fact that it was shapeless and dark, I could tell nothing about it. Then, Felurian reached out a hand, took hold of one of the thin beams of starlight, and pulled it toward the dark shape in her lap. I might have been more surprised if Felurian's manner hadn't been so casual. In the dim light, I saw her hands make a familiar motion. A second later, she reached out again, almost absent-mindedly, and grasped another narrow strand of starlight between her thumb and forefinger. She drew it in as easily as the first, and manipulated it in the same way. Again, the motion struck me as familiar, but it was nothing I could press my finger to. Felurian started to hum quietly to herself as she gathered in the next beam of starlight, brightening things an imperceptible amount. The shape in her lap looked like thick, dark cloth. Seeing this, I realized what she reminded me of. My father sewing. Was she sewing by starlight? Sewing with starlight. Realization came to me in a flood. Shade meant shadow. She had somehow brought back an armful of shadow and was sewing it with starlight. Sewing me a cloak of shadow. Sound absurd? It did to me, but regardless of my ignorant opinion, Felurian took hold of another strand of starlight and brought it to her lap. I brushed any doubt aside. Only a fool disbelieves what he sees with his own eyes. Besides, the stars above me were bright and strange. I was sitting next to a creature out of a storybook. She had been young and beautiful for 1,000 years. She could stop my heart with a kiss and talk to butterflies. Was I going to start quibbling now? After a while, I moved closer so I could watch more carefully. She smiled as I sat next to her, favoring me with a hasty kiss. I asked a couple questions, but her answers either made no sense or were hopelessly nonchalant. She didn't know the first thing about the laws of sympathy or sigildry or the Alar. She simply didn't think there was anything odd about sitting in the forest holding a handful of shadow. First, I was offended. Then, I was terribly jealous. I remembered when I'd found the name of the wind in her pavilion. It had felt as if I were truly awake for the first time. True knowledge running like ice in my blood. The memory exhilarated me for a moment, then left me with a broken chord of loss. My sleeping mind was slumbering again. I turned my attention back to Felurian and tried to understand. Before too long, Felurian stood in a fluid motion and helped me to my feet. She hummed happily and took my arm as we strolled back the way we had come, chatting of little things. She held the dark shape of the shade draped easily over her arm. Then, just as the first faint hint of twilight began to touch the sky, she hung it invisibly in the dark branches of a nearby tree. "Sometimes slow seduction is the only way," she said. "The gentle shadow fears the candle flame. How could your fledgling shade not feel the same?" Chapter 101. Close Enough to Touch. After our shadow-gathering expedition, I asked more pointed questions about Felurian's magic. Most of her answers continued to be hopelessly matter-of-fact. "How do you take hold of a shadow?" She motioned with one hand as if reaching for a piece of fruit. That was how, apparently. Other answers were nearly incomprehensible, filled with fey words I didn't understand. When she tried to describe those terms, our conversations became hopeless rhetorical tangles. At times, I felt like I'd found myself a quieter, more attractive version of Elodin. Still, I learned a few scraps. What she was doing with the shadow was called gramarye. When I asked, she said it was the art of making things be. This was distinct from glamoury, which was the art of making things seem. I also learned that there aren't directions of the usual sort in the Fae. Your trifoil compass is useless as a tin codpiece there. North does not exist, and when the sky is endless twilight, you cannot watch the sun rise in the east. But if you look closely at the sky, one piece of the horizon will be a shade brighter, in the opposite